Hi guys, this is Mrs. Hallman, and if you're watching this video, most likely you're a part of Anatomy 2 at your Excretory. If you're watching this on YouTube and you don't have access to the PowerPoint slideshow, feel free to send me a message through there and I can share it with you. If you are in class with me and you have access to this PowerPoint, you might want to open it up so that you can see some of these diagrams in more detail and also to process your notes. So this is part 2 of the screencast, which means that we've already kind of covered the basic steps of how the kidneys work and how the urinary system works in general. So what that means is if you're at this point now, we should have already gone through the 4 basic stages of how the nephron works. So this image again is showing us a nephron. You should notice some familiar structures to what we talked about in class before. So you should notice this structure here, this webbed network of capillaries called the glomerulus. You should also recognize the Bowman's capsule being the place that begins the tubules that will collect all of that filtrate. Remember that first step is going to filter out mostly large particles, keep those large particles in the blood, and anything small enough to get through the netting of the glomerulus will get through and go into the tubules. After filtration, remember that's step 1. Step 2, we go through reabsorption. So this is where we try to take some of those nutrients that we don't want to lose. So a great example of that is glucose. We want to keep all the glucose in the blood we can. So that can happen in the proximal tubule and a little bit in the loop of Henle as well. Then remember we go through secretion. So that third step, so filtration step 1, reabsorption step 2, third step secretion. This is when we would secrete out any impurities in the blood that we'd like to get rid of in our urine. And lastly, excretion, we talked about that at the end of the last time we covered this lecture. Excretion would be anything that collects in that distal tubule and collecting duct that would end up being our urine for our urine waste product. Okay, so what we're going to move on to today is really talking about some conditions involved with the urinary system and also talking about a little bit more of the biochemistry involved with the hormones and how it is that we control the flow of urine based on structures like the hypothalamus and the adrenal glands. So to start out here, let's talk about some of the things that we're really trying to get rid of in our body throughout this excretion process. So the number 1 product that we're trying to get rid of is a product called urea. And this is necessary because when we break down proteins in our diet, urea is a waste product. Urea is extremely basic, which means we need to dilute it. And it really does make up the main component of urine. If you can kind of imagine in your head that typical smell of urine, usually what you're smelling is that urea byproduct. Uric acid is actually a byproduct of breaking down DNA and RNA. So throughout our cell process, that central dogma, we use our own DNA to make these RNA copies. A lot of times we can recycle those nucleotides, break them down with enzymes, recharge them, and then build new RNA strips with them. But as cells die and decay, we do break down that DNA and RNA. In addition to all of the foods that we eat that come from living sources will contain DNA inside of their cells as well. We don't use the DNA of things that we eat, we get rid of it. So primarily that uric acid is going to come from the DNA of sources that we eat. Okay. Our third main cell waste product is going to be creatinine. And this is what happens when we break down muscle or as we use muscles. This is a waste product that is released. So these are the 3 main things that are going to be important for us to release in our urine in order to go through the normal excretion process. Now, we mentioned a lot of what our kidneys allow us to do, but we haven't talked about the functions that aren't directly related to excretion and urine output and those waste products. So the kidneys are also in charge of helping us maintain homeostasis of our blood. So if you think about our blood, we tend to keep it at a really neutral pH. The kidneys are able to help balance that through water and also through filtering out certain acidic or basic components to help neutralize that pH. The kidneys also, kind of an unrelated function, is that they actually are somewhat a gland in that they secrete erythropoietin, which is going to be a hormone that stimulates red blood cell formation. So the kidneys are also related that way. They're also related in vitamin D production, and that's the reason why urine samples are so beneficial for doctors, because the kidneys are involved in so much. When we look at urine, and if it's not in its proper balance, it's a really good indicator that something else bigger is going on. So let's talk about how it is that we control how much water we lose, because really the kidneys have all of those functions, but really the main thing they do is help homeostasis with how much water is in our body. So there's one hormone that you're absolutely going to need to know inside out and backwards, and that is this hormone called antidiuretic hormone. We abbreviate it ADH, and it kind of is what it sounds like. So if you've ever heard of a diuretic is anything that makes you pee more. So I always remember that coffee and tea are diuretics. They make you really have to use the bathroom. So an antidiuretic would be the opposite of that. So an antidiuretic is going to be something that makes you pee less. So think about this ADH hormone is going to restrict how much water is going to go into your urine, and it's going to make that water, instead of leaving through that collecting duct, it's going to reabsorb more during that loop of Henle and the collecting duct. So what that means is the more you increase your ADH, the more it is that the water is going to be reabsorbed, and the less you're going to actually excrete. Right? So why is this important? Well, we have a really delicate homeostasis with how much water we need in our body. So if we have no ADH present, that means that the collecting duct is going to release a large volume of water. We release anything that we can spare so that we dilute that urine, and we can keep all of those waste products really highly diluted. That dilution is pretty important. We'll learn that that's important because if you don't dilute all of the waste products that are leaving through your urine, those crystals of all of the creatinine and the uric acid can actually start to stick together. And we'll learn in a little bit that that's actually what causes kidney stones. So what happens if you secrete too much ADH, or maybe your body is triggered, or there's some sort of something in your diet that makes you release ADH? What that would mean is that in your collecting duct, your body would be triggered to reabsorb more of that H2O before it leaves in urine. What that would mean is it would really highly concentrate your urine. You can kind of see here in the image that all of these particles right here are really highly concentrated as it's leaving as urine, as opposed to being relatively dilute in this example over here. So, well, why does this matter? Well, we need to make sure that we have a really, really active homeostasis with water. We have learned, hopefully we've learned at this point, that water is kind of key for everything in our body. All biochemical reactions are aqueous, and we need them to take place in water. We've talked so much about how cells homeostasis are important for, or water is important for cells homeostasis and osmotic environments and yada, yada, yada. So the basic homeostasis for the kidneys and ADH is that if we would increase the amount of water in blood, so this would be a positive stimulus, the part of the brain called the hypothalamus would be triggered to receive that stimulus. The pituitary gland would be our effector gland, and basically they would reduce, so I have a little down arrow here, they would reduce the amount of antidiuretic hormone. Now, I know that's kind of like a double negative because we're reducing something that is antidiuretic. So really, let's think, is this going to make you pee more or pee less? Well, antidiuretic means no diuretic, so that's going to be no pee. But if we reduce the no pee antidiuretic, it means we're actually going to increase the amount of water so that we actually pee out. So I'm going to put increase pee. Great. The actual effector organ is going to be the kidney, and the response is that we're going to reabsorb less water into the blood, which means where's that water going to go? It's going to go into the pee. And all of that is going to lead to decreased water levels in the blood. So that's the way that we're able to kind of offset that feedback system, so that we have too much water in the blood, we are going to pee more out so that we maintain that homeostasis. Now, this is that same homeostasis feedback mechanism, a little bit more robust. It shows a little bit more detail, but essentially we just tracked this part of the loop where we talked about the water our body having too much water, and we talked about how it's going to release less antidiuretic hormone, thus diluting the urine and returning to normal. If we follow the second way, if we have too little water in our blood, so it's too concentrated, we need more water, our body is going to trigger our hypothalamus. It's going to release more antidiuretic hormone, which is going to, remember, reduce the amount that we're going to pee, which means we're going to conserve water. We're going to keep that water in our blood, and it's going to return our blood back to that homeostasis of the correct amount of blood volume in our blood. So that's how our kidneys help us maintain homeostasis. What happens if homeostasis is disrupted in another way? So let's say we get some type of infection, and we've all heard of UTIs, or urinary tract infections. They can be extremely painful, and they are a little bit more frequent in women than they are in men. And the reason for that is because of the length of the urethra. So in women, the urethra is much shorter, and in men, the urethra is much longer, which means the bacteria would have longer to travel from the outside world into the bladder, thus reducing the likelihood of getting a bladder infection. So there are two types of infections. You guys really don't need to know these terms. Know that essentially the two types of infections you can have would be a lower urinary tract or an upper urinary tract infection. One would be the infection of just the bladder. So this is probably the most common, and it's the least detrimental. It's pretty easy to recover from these. Basically, what happens is bacteria will travel through the urethra from the outside urethral opening, travel into the bladder. And if you think about it, the bladder is wet and warm and protected, which is the ideal breeding ground for bacteria. It can cause you to have that sensation of having to pee all of the time. It's painful urination. Usually you feel uncomfortable in that region. And a good warning sign that you have a UTI is your urine starts to get cloudy. And the reason for that cloudiness in your urine is that you're actually peeing out white blood cells, because your body's going to send an immune response to anywhere you have an infection. So those white blood cells are going to go into your urine, as well as that cloudiness is also going to be caused by the bacteria in your urine. Now, of the two, bladder infections are going to be a little bit more common, still super painful, but not quite as bad as kidney infections. So typically, if you have a kidney infection, it's a little bit worse, and it typically is going to also present with a bladder infection. This is when you have a bladder infection that will actually work its way up the ureters and into the kidney. This is a lot more dangerous because it's going to cause abdominal pain. It's going to cause a high fever. You're also going to see some of the other symptoms of the urinary tract infection, the lower urinary tract infection. But all in all, the kidney infection is much more detrimental. So let's talk about the upper versus lower tract. Whenever we talk about the upper respiratory or the upper urinary tract, we're talking about the parts of the system that would include the kidney, the ureter, and what we call the medulla and the cortex of the kidney. That's the upper tract. If we're talking about lower tract, we're talking about just the bladder and the urethra. So that's what we're referring to with those terms. Okay. So what are some things that can affect the frequency that you get a UTI? First of all, the one that is not on here is genetics. And that's just that if your body has developed and your urethra maybe is a little wider, or you're just genetically predisposed to having these infections, unfortunately, there's not much you can do with that. However, there are a lot of things that are in correlation with frequent UTIs. So women who are pregnant will get UTIs more common because the urethra is being pushed down by that uterus, and because they are urinating so much, and the body and the hormones are all kind of different because of the developing baby. When you change parts of your life cycle, so women in menopause are going to experience UTIs a little bit more. The bottom four really are some larger risk factors. So if you have chronic health conditions like diabetes or anything that would affect your kidneys, you're going to be at an increased rate for UTI. Obviously, with sexual activity, since you are bringing more bacteria from the outside world into your body, that's going to increase your risk of UTI, which is why urinating after sexual reproduction is always advised to help clean out and to sterilize your urethra. personal hygiene, so always making sure that ladies wipe front to back and always making sure that you wash properly and that bacteria doesn't get where it needs to be. Certain forms of birth control can also lead to more buildup of bacteria, which would increase your risk of UTIs as well. Definitely something to talk about with your primary physician if this is a reoccurring issue with you. Most UTIs are just treated with antibiotics and they go away pretty quickly. So let's talk about what happens when our urine is not properly diluted and all of those chemicals that we are trying to excrete, all of those crystals of those chemicals will start to form together. This is one of the most painful conditions known that is pretty common for humans, and that's kidney stones. So kidney stones can develop in the upper or lower urinary tract. You want to hope that they are in the lower urinary tract if you ever have to have them. They're much easier to pass from the bladder through the urethra than they are through the ureter. So this image down in the left-hand corner are examples of kidney stones that were removed from people. They can get large, quite large, and considering your ureter is about half the diameter of a pencil, I don't know about you, but passing a 2-inch chunk of basically chalk through the diameter of a pencil would really suck. So super, super painful. And you can see a lot of the crystals are not quite round, which means hopefully you're cringing right now. Those are reasons why kidney stones are so painful. So what causes kidney stones? Well, the largest effector is going to be your diet. So what types of food are you putting into your body? Are you consuming a lot of things like tea that has a tendency to crystallize and be pretty hard on your kidneys? Heredity and genetics is also a factor. If you're putting a lot of food in your body that's high in sodium and you're not consuming enough water, that means that you're going to be really concentrating that urine and you're going to increase the risk that those crystals are going to build up. There are some medications that will have this side effect. So typically if you're on those medications, they will partner that by saying you need to now like double your water consumption. Again, the easiest way to combat kidney stones is just making sure that you have enough water in your system to dilute that urine so they don't start to build up. You don't need to know any of these kidney stones. I just wanted to show you that they can be made out of different waste products. So we talked about uric acid being a waste product. There are also calcium stones and cysteine stones and struvite stones that will all deposit in your kidneys or your bladder depending on what you have in your diet. So last thing we're going to talk about is just why is it that in the urinalysis we did in class that diabetes, if you are diabetic, that you typically will have sugar in your urine. And really that comes down to stage 3 of or stage 2 of the urine process, of the urinary process. So in normal filtration, glucose will get right through that glomerulus and be caught in the Bowman's capsule. In normal people who do not have an issue with diabetes, we are able to reabsorb all of that glucose, and really that's where we want to be. However, in diabetics, remember, they have trouble absorbing glucose from their blood into their cells. So if they're insulin dependent, then that means that they're not able to really uptake that glucose into their cells. So where does it go? Well, it's going to get filtered out the kidneys. So because they have so much more glucose in their blood, they basically exceed how fast we can reabsorb it. So if it doesn't get reabsorbed in that second step of excretion, then it is going to go into the distal tubule and eventually into the collecting duct. Why else does that matter? Well, we know that water will always follow solute. So if we have a lot of glucose in our urine, it's going to actually draw water from our body into our urine, which is why another common side effect of diabetes is that you have to use the bathroom a lot. So that wraps up our lecture for the respiratory system. I hope that you have fun going through and processing your slides for these. And I did not realize there were 2 more slides. I'm going to cover these 2 real quick before we wrap up. This describes why it is that certain drinks that you drink, especially tea and coffee, will mean that you will pee more. So why is it that caffeine will actually affect how much you pee? The actual feedback mechanism is that the posterior pituitary gland, the thing that hangs down in the middle of your brain, is what is in charge of releasing ADH. Remember, ADH is anti-diuretic. So this is going to mean that you don't pee. All right, so think of this as kind of like the negative effects, so less pee. However, when you drink caffeine, it actually stimulates your adrenal gland. We know this because you get a lot of energy, you get adrenaline from drinking coffee. But in addition to that, it releases this molecule called aldosterone, and that has the opposite effect. That kind of counteracts the ADH, and it means that it increases the amount that you're actually going to pee after drinking caffeine. So that's why when you have a bunch of cups of coffee, you're going to be peeing for the rest of the day. The last idea for real is in this slideshow is going to be these things called ACE inhibitors. So the reason why I put this in here is that this is one of the most commonly prescribed drugs in America because it does help with so many things. So the main overall effect of ACE inhibitors is that they lower blood pressure. So if you'd ask around your family, I would be willing to bet that one of your aunts, one of your grandparents, or maybe your parents are on ACE inhibitors. Maybe you yourself are on ACE inhibitors. And they are used to decrease blood pressure. They're taken for not just high blood pressure, but they can also be prescribed for migraines, since that's typically what causes migraines is the pressure of the blood in the brain kind of pushing and causing that pain. It can be prescribed for somebody who has an arterial disease or diabetes. So the reason why these work is that they actually affect the size and the constriction of blood vessels. So let's talk about the actual mechanisms of ACE inhibitors. So first we need to know what is it inhibiting, right? An ACE inhibitor has to be inhibiting something. So let's look over here at a normal artery. So normal arteries are going to be about that diameter. And remember, arteries are always surrounded by smooth muscle cells, which means that those muscle cells can constrict and make the diameter of that artery smaller if needed. So what triggers it to do that? Well, we have a receptor on the outside of those smooth muscles, and this is called an ACE receptor. Now, if any of this is kind of ringing bells, you might be aware that I'm screencasting right now from home because we're in the middle of the COVID-19 outbreak. And there is actually a similar type of ACE receptors in the two types of cells in our respiratory tract, in our globulate cells in the back of our pharynx, and in our alveoli cells in our lungs that have a similar receptor. So if you remember from classes talking about COVID-19, we know a lot about the ACE receptors in our circulatory system, which is helping us kind of study the mechanism that that virus uses to gain entry into our cells. So there is this larger system called the renin-angiotensin system. It's a pretty complicated system, but all you really need to know is that it produces this thing called angiotensin, and this is actually going to be our trigger for constricting our blood vessel. Now, why does that matter? Well, if we constrict the amount of space that our blood has to go, think about your basic gas laws, your basic laws in chemistry, that if you decrease volume, you're going to increase pressure. So what that means is that if you have a lot of this angiotensin product being made in your body, it's going to contract your blood vessels and it's going to increase your blood pressure. So what does an ACE inhibitor do? Well, an ACE inhibitor is actually going to block that receptor so that that angiotensin product can't get in there and the blood vessel will stay dilated, it will stay wide. This will decrease your blood pressure. So all of this is to say that this ACE inhibitor is a pretty common medication that is used and prescribed, and it also might have some sort of role to play in the COVID-19 outbreak. So that is truly the end of our screen show today. Hope that was helpful.